The main hall of Los Angeles International Airport never truly slept. Even in the early hours, it pulsed like a living organism, breathing in waves of travelers and exhaling echoes of rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and hurried footsteps. Light poured down from the high glass ceiling in pale sheets, glinting off polished floors and endless panes of glass. Children clutched stuffed animals as their parents dragged carry-ons behind them. Executives murmured into Bluetooth headsets, eyes darting between departure boards and ticking watches. Tourists clustered around coffee kiosks, clinging to cups like lifelines. In the middle of that constant motion, one man walked at a pace that didn't match the chaos around him. He wasn't slow, exactly. He was steady, unrushed, as if he existed in a quieter world layered gently on top of this one. He wore a plain black t-shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed sneakers that had clearly known many sidewalks and many years. No entourage, no assistants, no sunglasses hiding his face, just a man carrying a small backpack over one shoulder, moving through the crowd as though airports were simply another place people passed through on the way to somewhere else. Most people didn't look twice. A few glanced at him, then looked again, brows tightening slightly as recognition tried and failed to fully form. There was something familiar there, something they almost knew. But familiarity without context is easy to dismiss, and in a place like Lax, everyone looks like someone. One detail, however, quietly distinguished him from the blur of motion around him. Hanging loosely around his neck, resting against the black fabric of his shirt, was a small silver crucifix. It wasn't ornate. It wasn't polished to brilliance. It looked worn, softened at the edges, dulled slightly by time and touch. It caught the overhead lights only when he moved just right, sending a faint glimmer across its surface before disappearing again. It didn't announce itself. It simply existed. Keanu Reeves passed through security without incident, thanked the officer who returned his ID, and slipped his shoes back on with an ease that suggested long familiarity with public spaces and quiet routines. He didn't scan the terminal for attention. He didn't lower his head to avoid it either. He moved the way people do when they are comfortable being exactly who they are. At the far end of the terminal, near the tall windows overlooking the runways, the first-class gate was already filling. Soft-spoken agents checked tickets. The low murmur of affluent comfort drifted through the roped-off area. Leather carry-ons, designer coats draped casually over arms, subtle fragrances that lingered even after people passed. When Keanu stepped into the priority line, he didn't look out of place so much as undefined. He didn't fit the expectation, and expectation has a way of hardening into silent judgment before anyone realizes it has. The flight attendant at the podium lifted her eyes automatically, prepared to offer the practice smile she'd given hundreds of times before. Her name tag read Carla. Her uniform was immaculate, hair smoothed back, posture precise. She had the look of someone who took pride in structure, in rules, in doing things the right way. Her gaze dropped to his boarding pass, then rose again to his face. Something in her expression shifted, not openly, not dramatically, but subtly like a shadow passing over glass. "I think you might be in the wrong line, sir," she said, her voice professional, light, and controlled. "This boarding group is for first class." Keanu met her eyes calmly, offering a small, polite smile. "I'm at the right gate." Carla glanced back down at the boarding pass, expecting to find confirmation of her assumption. Instead, she found his name, the seat number, the cabin designation, all correct. For half a second, something like recognition flickered across her face. She knew the name, of course, everyone did. But it didn't quite reconcile with the man in front of her. No tailored jacket, no watch glinting with status, no performance of importance. She handed the pass back, her smile returning but tighter now. "Of course, welcome aboard." Keanu thanked her and walked down the jet bridge without another word. Carla watched him go. She told herself she was only being observant, only doing her job. Yet her eyes didn't leave him as he disappeared into the aircraft, and when he turned slightly to adjust the strap of his bag, the silver crucifix shifted into clearer view. Something in her chest tightened. Inside the first-class cabin, everything was quiet luxury. Wide seats upholstered in cream leather, soft lighting that disguised time, the faint, constant hum of systems working invisibly behind the walls. Keanu found his seat, placed his bag beneath the console, and settled in without fuss. He fastened his seatbelt, rested his hands lightly on the armrests. He didn't immediately reach for a screen. He didn't open a book. He simply sat, breathing evenly, gazing out the window at the slow ballet of ground crews and aircraft beyond the glass. As the plane prepared for departure, Carla moved through the cabin with her colleagues, assisting passengers, offering drinks, ensuring bins were closed and seats upright. She performed each task smoothly, efficiently, yet her attention kept drifting back to one place, to one passenger, to the quiet man in black. From the galley, she glanced down the aisle again. The crucifix rested openly against his chest now, no longer half hidden by movement. It was small, unassuming, and yet to her it felt present, too present. She told herself it was nothing, a piece of jewelry, a private matter, but her eyes returned to it again and again as though her thoughts were being pulled there against her will. She had seen religious symbols before, plenty of them, but something about this, its simplicity, its openness, the way it lay there without apology, unsettled her. It didn't fit the polished neutrality she believed the cabin should embody. She had built her career on creating environments that were controlled, predictable, free of discomfort. That was professionalism. That was safety. That was her definition of harmony. And yet, without quite knowing when the decision formed, she found her feet moving. Carla stepped into the aisle and walked toward his seat with deliberate calm. Her posture was perfect, her expression carefully neutral. But inside, there was a small, growing tension she couldn't name. She stopped beside him and waited until he looked up. "Yes," Keanu asked gently. "Sir," she began, lowering her voice slightly. "I just wanted to remind you that we aim to maintain a neutral, comfortable environment for all passengers, especially in this cabin." Keanu listened without interruption. "Sometimes," she continued, "overt personal symbolism can make others uneasy. We ask, when possible, that such expressions remain discreet." He glanced down briefly at the crucifix, then back up at her. "Is there a rule I've broken?" She hesitated. "It's not a rule exactly, it's a guideline for shared spaces." "I've flown many times wearing this," he said calmly. "No one has ever mentioned it." Carla forced a light smile. "Times change, sensitivities change, we just try to be considerate of everyone." Keanu's voice remained steady. "You're asking me to hide this?" She nodded slightly. "If you wouldn't mind." There was no anger in his face, no defensiveness, only quiet clarity. "This isn't decoration," he said, "and it isn't a statement, it's part of who I am." Around them, the cabin remained outwardly calm, but subtle shifts were happening. A woman across the aisle paused her screen. A man 2 rows back tilted his head slightly. Awareness was spreading, silent but alert. Carla straightened a fraction. "We respect that," she said, her tone smoothing. "We simply ask for discretion." "With respect," Keanu replied, "I believe I'm being singled out." Her brows drew together. "That's not the intention." "If someone wore a stone or a leaf or a symbol you didn't recognize," he said quietly, "would you ask them to conceal it?" She didn't answer immediately. The air between them felt suddenly denser, as though the space itself were listening. Keanu met her eyes. "This crucifix has been with me in hospital rooms, in war zones, in nights I wasn't sure I'd see the morning. I don't wear it to provoke anyone. I wear it because it reminds me I'm still here." The words were soft, but they carried. For a moment, Carla's professional composure faltered, just slightly, enough for those nearby to see that something unexpected had touched her. She drew in a controlled breath. "I'll give you a moment," she said, and stepped back. Keanu didn't move. The crucifix remained where it was. And though no voices were raised, something unmistakable had begun. Not a scene. Not an argument. A quiet fracture in the ordinary flow of things. A moment that, before this flight ended, would change far more than anyone in that cabin yet realized. The aircraft had reached cruising altitude, and with that gentle, almost imperceptible leveling of motion, the cabin settled into its familiar suspended calm. Outside the windows, the world had transformed into an endless ocean of cloud, glowing faintly gold where the late afternoon sun brushed their upper edges. Inside, first class breathed with quiet affluence. The low murmur of conversation returned. A soft clink of glass as champagne flutes were set onto polished trays. The subtle glide of attendants down the aisle, shoes barely whispering against carpet. To an outside observer, it would have looked like any other premium flight, composed, orderly, insulated from urgency. Yet beneath that surface, something unseen had begun to stir, like pressure building along a fault line. Keanu remained where he was, hands resting calmly on the armrests, posture relaxed but awake. He had not returned to the window. He had not closed his eyes. He simply sat present as though he were listening not to sound but to something quieter beneath it. The silver crucifix lay against his chest, unmoved, its dull sheen catching the cabin light whenever he shifted even slightly. It was not elevated. It was not displayed. It simply existed, and in that quiet existence it seemed to carry a gravity far heavier than its size. From the galley, Carla pretended to organize service carts, but her attention refused to settle. Her fingers adjusted napkins that were already aligned, repositioned glasses that did not need moving. Her mind replayed the exchange over and over, but now not as she had experienced it, now as it must have looked. The man's stillness, his refusal to perform either offense or obedience, the way he had spoken of hospital rooms, of nights he hadn't expected to survive. The words lingered where she didn't want them. They pressed against memories she usually kept folded neatly away. She had built her career on anticipation, on identifying discomfort before it bloomed, on smoothing edges before anyone else noticed them. In training, they called it cabin management. In her own mind, she called it control. Control over space, over tone, over atmosphere. Control had always felt like safety. But now, for the first time in a long while, she felt it slipping, and what unsettled her most was not his refusal. It was the possibility that he might be right. She stepped out again, this time not toward him, but down the aisle, her eyes scanning the cabin. A man across the way pretended to scroll, though his screen hadn't changed. A woman's gaze followed Carla, then drifted back to Keanu. The awareness was no longer subtle. It had congealed into something communal, unspoken but shared. A sense that this was no longer about jewelry or policy or even religion. It was about whether someone could be quietly asked to make themselves smaller for the comfort of others, and whether silence itself could be a form of harm. Carla turned back toward him. When she stopped at his seat this time, her voice carried a slightly firmer edge, as though she were bracing it against something inside herself. "Sir," she said, "I've received comments from other passengers." Keanu looked up attentive. "About what?" She paused, just long enough for the truth to resist being shaped. "About the presence of visible ideological symbols in an enclosed, shared space. We try to maintain an environment where everyone feels comfortable." "A symbol of faith makes people uncomfortable," he asked quietly. She exhaled. "Some feel it can be divisive." He leaned forward a fraction, not confrontational, but engaged. "Then maybe the discomfort isn't caused by the symbol. Maybe it's caused by what people have been taught to see when they look at it." The words moved through the space with more force than their volume suggested. A couple seated nearby exchanged glances. 2 rows back, someone subtly lowered their phone from their ear and angled it instead toward the aisle. Carla felt her authority thinning, like ice under too many steps. "I'm asking you to cooperate," she said, a trace of tension now evident beneath her professional tone. "If you refuse, I'll have to escalate this." "To whom?" Keanu asked. "To the captain, and if necessary, to security upon landing." That changed the texture of the air. Not louder, not dramatic, but heavier, more real. Keanu studied her face, not critically, but with an attention that felt almost compassionate. "You can call whoever you need to," he said. "But understand this. The problem is what's on my chest. It's what's in your eyes." The silence that followed was total. It wasn't the kind that comes from shock. It was the kind that comes from recognition. From the sudden sense that something honest has been placed in the center of a room, and everyone must now decide whether to look at it. Carla took a step back, not deliberately, almost involuntarily. For the first time since she'd put on her uniform that morning, she was no longer certain what the correct response was supposed to be. She turned sharply and walked toward the front, her heels sounding louder than they had before. 5 minutes later, the cockpit door opened. Captain Morales stepped into the cabin with the composed gravity of a man accustomed to responsibility. His hair was touched with gray, his posture unhurried. He carried himself not as an authority to be wielded, but as a presence to be relied upon. Carla moved quickly to meet him, speaking in a low voice, explaining the situation in clipped procedural terms. A passenger, non-compliance, a visible religious item, a refusal to follow a request. He listened without interruption, then he turned to the younger attendant standing nearby. "And you?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing briefly toward Keanu. "He's been calm, sir, respectful, he didn't escalate anything." Morales nodded, once then walked down the aisle. Every eye tracked him. When he reached Keanu's seat, he didn't loom, he didn't posture, he simply stopped, hands loosely folded behind his back. "Mr. Reeves," he said, voice even. "I'm Captain Morales. I'd like to understand what happened from your perspective." Keanu met his gaze. "Your attendant asked me to hide this," he said, touching the crucifix lightly. "She said it might make others uncomfortable. I told her it's part of who I am, that it's been with me in moments when I didn't know if I would survive. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't refuse to be respectful. I only refused to hide." The cabin had grown so still that the soft hum of the engines felt suddenly loud. Morales let a moment pass, then turned back to Carla. "Did he speak to you aggressively?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "No." "Did he disrupt the cabin?" "No." Morales nodded slowly. He turned again to Keanu. "You're within your rights to wear it," he said. "There is no policy against it, and there will be no further action taken." The words were not harsh, they were not triumphant, they were simply final. A subtle release moved through the cabin, like a breath people hadn't realized they were holding. Keanu inclined his head in thanks. Morales gave a small nod in return and turned back toward the cockpit. Carla remained where she was. For a long moment, she did not follow him. She stood there, facing the man she had tried to correct, to manage, to quietly diminish. And in the mirror of his calm, she saw what she had not wanted to see in herself: fear dressed as neutrality, control mistaken for care, judgment that had never been spoken but had lived comfortably in her eyes. She walked back to the galley, her steps slower now. Her phone vibrated once in her pocket. Then again, then again. She didn't need to look. Somewhere in the cabin, someone had recorded. Somewhere beyond the plane, a world was already beginning to watch. But for the first time, what frightened her was not that others might see. It was that she finally had. And in that realization, something inside her began to crack. Not loudly, not violently, but in the quiet, irreversible way that precedes real change. The first sign that something beyond the aircraft had begun to move came not from an announcement or a confrontation, but from a vibration Carla could no longer ignore. The soft, persistent hum from her pocket pulsed again against her thigh as she stood in the galley pretending to reorganize supplies that no longer required organizing. She had dismissed the first few alerts automatically, the way crew members are trained to dismiss the outside world once the cabin door closes. But this time her hand lingered. Her fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of her uniform, and she felt a familiar reflex rising, delay, deflect, maintain composure. Then she broke it. She reached into her pocket and looked. The screen lit her face in pale blue, a message from her sister, then another from a colleague who wasn't even on this flight, then one from a number she didn't recognize. The words blurred at first, but the meaning didn't. "Is this you? What happened on that flight? It's everywhere." She didn't need to open the link to know. She already saw it in her mind, her posture, her voice, the measured distance in her words, the quiet firmness in his. She had spent years mastering the art of being unseen while controlling everything. Now the very moment she had thought small was unfolding without her consent across screens she would never touch. She slipped the phone back into her pocket as though it might burn her. Her chest felt tight, but not with anger, with recognition. With the slow, unwelcome awareness that something she had done in a narrow space with limited witnesses had stepped into a far larger world where intention mattered less than truth. Beyond the galley curtain, the cabin had changed again. It was not merely attentive now. It was reflective. Conversations had resumed, but their tone was softer, more careful, as if everyone sensed they were sharing space with something that would outlast the flight itself. A man near the window leaned toward his partner, speaking quietly. But his eyes drifted again, and again toward seat 2A. A woman 2 rose up, stared out at the clouds. Her reflection superimposed faintly over the endless white. Her brow knit as though something she hadn't expected to feel had settled inside her. Keanu had not moved much. He accepted a glass of water when it was offered, thanked the attendant, set it aside untouched. He looked neither victorious nor wounded. He looked thoughtful, as though the moment had brushed something personal, something older, something not meant for an audience. The crucifix still rested where it had before, not elevated, not emphasized, simply present. Carla remained in the galley, one hand braced against the counter. The curtain fluttered faintly with the motion of the plane. For the first time in her career, she wished she were invisible, not to escape consequences, but to escape herself. She replayed the exchange again, but now without justification. She heard the edge she had denied. She saw the hesitation she had called professionalism. She recognized the unspoken assumption that had preceded every word she'd chosen. She had not asked him to hide a necklace. She had asked him to make her more comfortable. And she had called it policy. A memory rose uninvited, drifting up from a part of her life she rarely touched. Her grandmother, sitting at a small kitchen table with a chipped mug and tired hands, saying softly, "Kindness isn't about what you allow others to show. It's about what you don't ask them to conceal." Carla had been young then, idealistic. She had believed that warmth alone could fix what structure could not. Somewhere along the way, warmth had been replaced with procedure, and procedure had been mistaken for goodness. Her phone vibrated again. This time she opened it. A clip filled the screen. The aisle, the lighting, her own voice calm and controlled, explaining neutrality, then his, quiet, steady. "The problem is what's on my chest, it's what's in your eyes." The words sounded different when she heard them from outside herself. They no longer felt pointed. They felt true. She lowered the phone slowly. Around her the galley hummed with the gentle sounds of flight, cooling units, distant footsteps, the faint clink of a tray. The world had not ended. The plane was still moving, but something inside her had shifted from defense to reckoning. When she finally stepped back into the aisle, she didn't head toward him at first. She walked slowly toward the forward restroom, passing rows of passengers who now looked at her differently. Not with hostility, not with triumph, with curiosity, with a strange, quiet openness, as though they too were waiting to see what she would do now that the moment had found its way into the light. She turned before reaching the door, and instead she walked toward seat 2A. The distance felt longer than it had earlier. Each step seemed to cross not carpet but memory, intention, self-image. When she reached him, she did not speak immediately. She stood there, hands folded before her, uniform immaculate, posture no longer quite as rigid. Keanu looked up. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Carlo inhaled and the breath shook. "I told myself I was being professional," she said quietly, "that I was protecting the environment, that I was being neutral." Her voice wavered, but she did not stop. "But I wasn't neutral. I was uncomfortable, and instead of facing that, I asked you to carry it for me." The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise the cabin. They were not scripted. They were not polished. They were simply true. Keanu listened. "I've spent my life believing control meant care," she continued. "That if I could smooth every surface, remove every possible point of tension, then I was doing something good. But today I realized I was only protecting myself, and I used authority to do it." Her eyes glistened now, though she did not let the tears fall. "I'm sorry." The word hung between them, fragile and unadorned. Keanu did not answer immediately. He studied her face, not to assess her sincerity, but as though he were seeing something new there, something emerging. "Thank you for saying that," he replied at last. "Not it's okay. Not don't worry. Thank you." The simplicity of it disarmed her more than anger ever could have. "I don't know how to fix what I did," she said softly. "You don't fix it," he replied. "You face it, that's where it starts." Something in her expression broke then, not into collapse but into release. A breath left her chest that felt like it had been held for years. She nodded once as if to anchor herself. Around them no one spoke, but many watched, not as spectators. As witnesses. Carla straightened slowly. She did not return immediately to her duties. She did not retreat. She remained there a moment longer, then said, "Would you mind if I sat for a moment?" Keanu gestured gently to the empty space beside him. "If you need to." She did. And as she lowered herself into the seat, the uniform she wore no longer felt like armor. It felt like fabric. And somewhere between the steady beat of the engines and the endless light beyond the windows, the meaning of the flight quietly changed. It was no longer simply carrying people from one city to another. It was carrying a moment, one that had already begun to travel far beyond the sky. The remainder of the flight unfolded in a way none of the passengers would ever again call ordinary. Service continued. Trays were cleared. Drinks were offered. The low hum of conversation returned in fragments, but it carried a different tone now, as though everyone had unconsciously agreed to speak more softly, to move more gently, to leave room for something unnamed that had settled among them. Carla eventually rose from the seat beside Keanu and returned to her duties, but she did so changed. Her movements were slower, not from hesitation, but from awareness. Each step felt deliberate. Each interaction carried weight. She no longer performed courtesy, she inhabited it. From time to time, she caught glances directed her way, some curious, some sympathetic, some searching. She did not avoid them. For the first time in years, she did not attempt to manage the cabin's perception of her. She allowed it to exist. Keanu returned to his quiet observation of the world beyond the window. When Carla passed his seat with a fresh glass of water, he thanked her. When she thanked him in return, the words felt mutual rather than procedural. No further discussion followed. None was needed. Something essential had already been spoken. But outside the aircraft, the world was no longer quiet. By the time the plane began its gradual descent, the video had crossed oceans faster than any jet ever could. Screens lit up in airport lounges, office break rooms, hospital waiting areas, and living rooms where people had paused mid-conversation, mid-scroll, mid-thought. Headlines framed the clip in 100 different ways. Some praised his calm. Some condemned her action. Some argued about symbols, policies, and belief. But beneath every interpretation, there pulsed a simpler current. A quiet moment had revealed something uncomfortable, and people recognized themselves in it. Carla's phone vibrated again as the seatbelt sign chimed on. She did not reach for it this time. She already knew. What mattered now was not what people were saying, but what she would do when the wheels touched ground. As the aircraft lowered through layers of cloud, the cabin lights dimmed to landing mode, casting everything in a softer hue. The earth rose slowly into view, sprawling and intricate, a reminder that life did not pause for reckoning. It only waited for it. Carla took her position near the front for landing procedures, but her mind was elsewhere. With each passing minute, fragments of her past drifted forward uninvited. The early days of her career when she had believed service meant seeing people. The gradual shift, so subtle she had never named it, when efficiency replaced presence, when neutrality became a shield rather than a bridge. She realized she could not recall the exact moment she had stopped asking herself why she enforced certain things, and started caring only that they were enforced. The aircraft touched down smoothly, the familiar thud and rolling vibration grounding them back into the ordinary world. Applause did not break out. No one cheered. Instead, there was a collective exhale, as if everyone understood that the flight itself had not been the destination. When the plane taxied to the gate and the doors finally opened, the sound of the terminal poured in like a tide. Announcements, engines, voices, the smell of coffee and recycled air. The seatbelt sign extinguished, and passengers rose, gathering belongings, reforming into individuals again after sharing something intimate without ever having spoken its name. Carla stood near the cockpit door as they deplaned, thanking passengers as she always had. But now each thank you was not a reflex, it was a choice. Some passengers met her eyes and nodded, some smiled faintly. A woman touched her arm gently as she passed and said, "We all learn." Carla felt her throat tighten, but she returned the nod. She did not hide. Keanu was among the last to stand. He lifted his bag, waited patiently, and stepped into the aisle. When he reached her, she met his gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he inclined his head slightly. She did the same. "Take care," he said. "You too," she replied. He moved past her and into the terminal, disappearing into the flow of travelers just as he had before, indistinguishable at a glance, yet irrevocably set apart in her memory. The crucifix caught the light once more as he walked away, then vanished into the crowd. Only after the last passenger had exited did Carla allow herself to look at her phone. The screen bloomed with notifications. Missed calls, messages, articles, clips, her name, her face, her words now detached from intention and floating free in the digital air. She scrolled once, then stopped. There was no comfort there, no guidance, only reflection refracted through strangers. A message from airline management appeared near the top of the screen. She did not open it yet. Instead, she stepped into the quiet of the empty cabin. Without passengers, the aircraft felt suddenly enormous. Rows of vacant seats, abandoned headsets, folded blankets, the traces of 100 lives passing through. She walked slowly down the aisle until she reached the row where he had sat. She paused there, resting her hand lightly on the back of the seat, as though it might still hold the imprint of the moment. She had not been cruel, she had not raised her voice, she had not insulted him. And yet she had been wrong. For the first time, she did not soften that truth. She accepted it. She took a breath that felt like the first unguarded one she had taken in years and turned back toward the galley. There, she opened the message from management. It was brief, professional, measured. A request that she report to the airline's regional office before her next assignment. No accusation, no absolution, only a conversation to be had. She closed her eyes. This was the descent she had not anticipated. Not the lowering of altitude, but the shedding of a version of herself she could no longer inhabit. That evening, alone in her small apartment, she sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing the uniform she had not yet folded away. The city glowed faintly through the window. Traffic murmured below. Her phone lay face-up beside her, lit with the aftermath of the day. She did not scroll. Instead, she stared at her own reflection in the darkened glass of the screen. "I don't know who I am without the rules," she whispered to the empty room. The words startled her. She realized then how long she had leaned on structure to tell her who she was. How rarely she had asked herself what she believed when no one was grading her response. She rose, crossed the room, and opened a small drawer she had not touched in years. Inside were fragments of another self, an old photograph, a handwritten note, a thin chain with a tiny, worn charm her grandmother had once given her. She held it in her palm and closed her fingers around it, feeling the familiar pressure of something simple and unremarkable and suddenly very heavy. For the first time since the flight, tears came freely. Not from shame alone. From the strange, trembling awareness that she stood at the beginning of something, not the end. And beginnings, she was learning, were always more frightening than endings. The regional office stood on the quieter side of the city, a modern glass structure framed by palms and wide concrete walkways that reflected the pale morning sun. Carla arrived early, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she could not bear to sit still any longer. The night before had passed without sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the aisle of the aircraft, the steady calm of his expression, the weight of her own words returning to her from the screen of her phone. She had not responded to interviews. She had not defended herself online. She had not issued a statement. Something in her understood that public noise would not resolve a private reckoning. She sat in her car for a long moment before getting out, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slow, as if steadying herself before stepping into weather. When she finally entered the building, the lobby was nearly empty. The polished floor reflected her uniform back at her, perfect in cut, familiar in shape, and suddenly strange. She checked in with reception and was directed to a conference room overlooking the runway of a nearby municipal airport. Small planes lifted and descended beyond the glass, silent at this distance, their movement almost meditative. She was not kept waiting long. Two representatives joined her, both professional, both composed, both clearly trained to separate behavior from personhood. They thanked her for coming. They acknowledged the public attention. They explained that the airline was reviewing the incident not only for public relations but for internal practice. There would be no instant conclusions, no dramatic pronouncements, but there would be conversation, training reassessment, and a formal evaluation of her conduct. Carla listened without interruption. She felt no urge to argue. When they finished, one of them asked, gently, "Is there anything you'd like to say before we proceed?" She looked out the window first, at a small plane lifting into the pale sky, at the way it rose not by force but by balance. "Yes," she said finally, "I was wrong." The words did not tremble, they did not posture, they simply landed. "I didn't break a rule," she continued. "But I violated something deeper. I asked someone to hide a part of himself because it unsettled me. I called it professionalism because that made it easier to live with. It was fear and control, and a misunderstanding of what neutrality really means." The representatives exchanged brief glances, then returned their attention to her. "I don't want this to disappear behind a statement," she said. "I don't want to be reassigned quietly and pretend nothing happened. If I continue working here, I want to do it differently. I want to learn, and I want to help make sure others don't repeat what I did thinking they're being helpful." There was a long pause, not uncomfortable, considered. One of them nodded slowly. "That willingness matters," she said. "Whatever comes next, this will be part of it." When the meeting ended, Carla walked out into the open air feeling neither condemned nor absolved. She felt responsible, and for the first time that did not feel like a threat. It felt like a ground to stand on. The following days unfolded in a blur of quiet decisions. She declined multiple media requests. She did not disappear, but she did not perform remorse either. Instead, she began writing. Not a statement, but a record. She wrote about her grandmother, about the early years of her career, about the moment when control began to feel safer than connection, about the fear of making mistakes that had slowly taught her to avoid seeing people fully. She wrote about the flight not as an incident, but as a mirror. Each evening, she sat at the small desk near her window and filled pages she never intended to publish. The act itself felt like returning something she had borrowed from herself years earlier. Messages continued to arrive, some angry, some kind, some from strangers sharing their own moments of misjudgment, their own quiet regrets, their own private transformations sparked by a short video in a narrow aisle at 30,000 feet. Carla read them slowly. She did not defend, she did not explain, she listened. One message in particular lingered. It was from a man who wrote, "I saw myself in you, and I didn't like what I saw, so I apologized to my son today for something I never thought mattered." She read it 3 times before closing her eyes and letting the meaning of it settle. It was not about her. It had never been. It was about what moments reveal when they are honest. A week later, the airline informed her she would be placed on temporary leave, not as punishment, but as part of a broader review. During that time, she would be invited to participate in internal workshops and to contribute to the redesign of certain crew training modules focused on cultural sensitivity, personal expression, and unconscious bias. The words felt surreal when she read them. Not because she felt vindicated, but because the place where she had failed was now asking her to help illuminate that failure for others. She accepted. On her first day back in the training center, she stood in a small room with 12 other attendants seated in a circle. Some recognized her. Some did not. She was not introduced as the woman from the video. She was introduced simply as Carla, a senior crew member invited to share an experience. When she spoke, she did not describe the headlines. She described the feeling of certainty, the comfort of policy, the subtle seduction of believing that professionalism means never being unsettled. She spoke about how easily neutrality becomes a mask and how quickly that mask can silence someone else. "I didn't wake up wanting to hurt anyone," she told them. "But harm doesn't require intention, it requires blindness, and blindness often looks like confidence." No one interrupted, no one checked their phone. She saw in their faces not accusation, but recognition. And she realized then that redemption is rarely dramatic. It is repetitive. It is built not in apologies, but in altered patterns. That evening, she returned home and found a small package waiting at her door. No return address. Inside, wrapped simply in brown paper, was a thin chain and a small silver crucifix worn at the edges, familiar in its quiet shape. There was no note, no explanation. She did not need one. She sat down on the edge of her bed, holding it in her palm, feeling its weight, remembering the way it had rested against black fabric in the soft light of a cabin that no longer existed. She did not put it on. She did not interpret it. She closed her fingers around it and whispered, "Thank you." Not to him. To the moment. To the fracture that had let light in. Outside, the city breathed. Inside, something long rigid continued slowly to soften. And though the world still spoke in noise, her life had begun to answer in choices. 3 months passed, and the world's attention, as it always did, drifted on. New headlines replaced old ones. New arguments rose where others had cooled. The video that once pulsed across every platform slowed into the long tail of the internet's memory, occasionally resurfacing in compilations about kindness or quiet strength, but no longer commanding the relentless present. Yet inside Carla's life, nothing had returned to what it was. The stillness that had once frightened her had become something she welcomed, because within it, she could hear herself again. Her leave from active duty had ended not with a dramatic announcement, but with a simple email and a revised schedule. She was not assigned immediately back to long-haul routes. Instead, she spent her first weeks rotating through training rooms, co-facilitating sessions that explored not just customer service, but self-awareness. The airline had reframed its approach in subtle but meaningful ways, shifting emphasis from managing passengers to understanding people. Carla did not stand before those rooms as someone redeemed. She stood as someone honest. She spoke about fear, about assumptions, about the quiet ways authority can become armor. She watched as new attendants, and even veterans with decades in the sky, leaned forward not because policy demanded attention, but because recognition invited it. Sometimes, after sessions ended, people lingered. They told her about moments they regretted, about glances they wished they could retrieve, about comments they had never said but had lived with anyway. Carla listened, not to guide them, not to correct them, but to witness them. In those conversations, she learned something that surprised her. Accountability, when carried without defense, has a way of giving others permission to be gentle with themselves without being dishonest. At home, she kept the small crucifix in a simple wooden box on her desk. She had not worn it. It was not hers to adopt as a symbol. Instead, she treated it as a reminder. When training felt routine again, when fatigue made her impatient, when old reflexes whispered that control would be easier than care, she would open the box, look at the worn silver surface, and remember not the man, but the moment she first saw herself clearly. One afternoon, after a long day of workshops, she walked along the beach near her apartment, shoes in hand, the tide washing softly over her feet. The ocean stretched out in muted blues and silvers beneath a hazy sky. She watched a child run from the water, laughing as his mother waited with open arms. The simplicity of it struck her with unexpected force. No management, no policies, no careful distance, only presence. She sat on the sand and let the wind move through her hair. And for the first time since the flight, she felt something like peace not earned through effort, but received through acceptance. It was there, watching the horizon, that her phone vibrated. The message was short, no introduction, no formal tone. I heard about the work you've been doing. I wanted you to know it matters, not because of what happened, but because of what you chose to do afterward. Keep going. K. Carla stared at the screen. She did not smile immediately. She did not rush to reply. Her eyes filled slowly, not with the sharpness of shame, but with the quiet fullness of gratitude. She typed and erased 3 responses before settling on the only one that felt honest. Thank you for meeting me with truth instead of anger. I'm trying to live up to that. A few minutes passed, then a final message appeared. You already are. She lowered the phone and looked back out at the sea. The water moved as it always had, indifferent to human reckonings, carrying light across its surface without asking who deserved it. She understood then something she had not on the flight. He had never tried to change her. He had only refused to become smaller for her comfort. The rest had been her work to do. Weeks later, she returned to the sky. Her first flight back was not first class. It was an early morning domestic route filled with tired families, construction workers, students, and grandparents clutching boarding passes with careful fingers. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and anticipation. Carla stood at the door as passengers boarded, greeting them not with the polished warmth she had perfected, but with something quieter and truer. She looked at faces now, not categories. She noticed nervous hands, a child's excitement, a man's exhaustion. She found herself slowing where she once hurried, listening where she once managed. Midway through boarding, an elderly woman stepped forward, her movements tentative, her coat too thin for the morning chill. Around her neck hung a small wooden pendant carved into a shape Carla did not recognize. The woman caught Carla's glance and instinctively moved to tuck it into her blouse. Carla's heart stilled. Gently, before the motion could complete, she said, "You don't need to hide that." The woman paused, surprised. "Oh, I just didn't want to." "You don't need to," Carla repeated softly. "It's part of you." The woman studied her face, then let the pendant fall back into view. "Thank you," she said. Carla felt something settle into place inside her. Not pride, not relief. Alignment. As the plane lifted into the sky, carrying a new collection of lives across a familiar distance, Carla took her position in the aisle. The engine's steady rhythm filled the cabin. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and somewhere between the clouds and the quiet work of care, she understood what remained when moments pass and attention fades. Not the video, not the arguments, not even the apology. What remains is who we become when no one is recording. What remains is the way we look at others when we are no longer defending ourselves. What remains is the choice to meet difference not with control, but with curiosity. Not with fear, but with presence. Not with silence, but with sight. And as Carla moved gently through the cabin, offering water, offering smiles, offering nothing more extraordinary than simple human regard, she realized that the most powerful symbols are not worn. They are lived.